Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have accountability for some, protection for others, lessons from the Epstein files, and that looks like a picture, I guess, of a bunch of people at a table, and it says, and then the OP, and that's supposed to be by the chaotic mage, and they added, the January 2026 DOJ release exposed victims' names and photos were redacting alleged pet perpetrators. I wrote this to highlight how wealth and influence let the powerful avoid consequences that ordinary people would face. Link to article, and they link to their article about that, I guess, and that's entitled Impunity in Plain Sight. And yeah, personally, I guess I would agree with that. As a lot of law does tend to be pirates and emperors, as I always like to say. When the individual, when a small scale or lesser individual does it, it's a crime. But when the state or a high profile actor does it, it's just the law, and that's very much what you see with the Epstein files. Ultimately, pretty much none of them are going to be held accountable. Maybe some exceptions, like Prince Andrew was just arrested, but those are just that exceptions. You're just going to have a fall guy or two to make it look like you're holding them accountable. In reality, the elites are just going to continue go on regardless, and just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter what people do anymore. It really matters who does what, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Half Baked Fury, The Law is a Weapon, posted by Helicopter Bright 8580. And they said, my dad, sales manager, was telling me some tactics, and one of the things he mentioned was the typical person's preference for loss aversion. People don't want a high upside as often as they want a low downside. It makes sense, as we're biologically wired to be afraid of threats, and for that fear to be uncomfortable enough to influence our behavior. OTOH, we aren't wired very well to perceive a tangible gain. Life is required, prosperity is optional. Consider also the literal state of a ceiling versus a floor. The sky is the limit, but we're not birds, versus low floor being a very real threat to tree climbers. And seeing another post satirically claiming to have had a face scanner installed in the toilet to prevent illegals from sneaking in and using the bathroom, I was reminded of this crucial aspect of human nature. I often wonder why people are so easily willing to sacrifice freedom for security, shout out to Benjamin Franklin, but in finding myself among the minority who are actually willing to take high risk for uncertain reward and regularly criticize for my responsibility, my libertarian politics suddenly makes more sense. Average people want to ban things that make them uncomfortable. This is defaulting to loss aversion. The upside is the unnatural state of a capitalist liberal democracy, which is demonstrably best for everyone. The downside is a possible death because, insert current news headline, as tragic as it is, it makes sense that people will always try to kill scary things without considering the consequences. Tyranny is the norm for a reason, or many. Please share any thoughts. And yeah, personally, I would agree with all that. The state is naturally gonna try and enforce what it feels is right, and that's going to be inherently up to the person who's ever running it. And I think the libertarian position is, ultimately each person has their own definition of right and wrong, and as long as they're not hurting anyone else or enforcing their definition of right or wrong on someone else, they should be able to do whatever they want. That's very much how libertarianism works, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have former Prince Andrew arrested following Epstein files revelations. Original title from NBCNews.com, posted by Doctor Who 07. And yeah, personally, I think he's just a fall guy. The vast majority of the Epstein circle isn't going to be held accountable. But they just want to make it look like they're doing something in regards to it. I know some people are saying, "Oh, it's the UK is actually holding them accountable. The US isn't." Well, in reality, I think even in the UK there are probably other Epstein clients that are not talking about. And yeah, I do also think a good thing I read was, he's no longer in the big club since he's no longer a part of the royal family since they kicked him out, and that's another good thing to consider as well. So ultimately, yeah, I definitely do think, he's just a convenient fall guy, and the Epstein files won't have nearly as big a result as people are saying they will. It's a lot like how I said in my last episode, back in the year 2010s, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers showed that elites were committing massive amounts of tax evasion, and pretty much no one was punished for it. It's a lot like that with the Epstein files, I would say. Next, we have researchers declare AI model conscious. ICE immediately seizes and detains it. Posted by Patom13, and that's a Tom the Dancing Bug comic. And yeah, personally, I think this is just kind of another shitlib Reddit comic. And ultimately, if you want to share shitlib comics, that you should be able to. With that being said, people are tired of the constant circle jerks of ICE bad, Trump bad, etc., etc. I personally don't care for ICE or Trump, but you don't have to constantly bring them up every single day. that's very much Reddit for you. It gets hyper fixated on stuff like Trump or ICE, and then they just don't shut up about it. If you want to talk about them constantly, you should be able to talk about them as much as you want to. But ultimately, people are gonna get tired when you say the same thing every single day forever. Next, we have the Hawks are lying us into yet another Middle Eastern war from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but that's kind of par for the course at this point. It was Iraq back in the 2000s, looks like it's going to be Iran for the 2020s. And, ultimately, I don't think we should be going into foreign wars, but ultimately, the government, the American empire is going to justify what it wants to justify, and oftentimes there's nothing like me, an American peasant, can really do about it. And that just goes to show you that, the government can justify whatever it wants to justify, and there's oftentimes no ways you stop them. A lot of people say, well, what about voting? And, just because if voting really mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. It would still be happening probably under Kamala. Maybe she wouldn't be as up Israel's ass as Trump is when in regards to pushing for war with Iran. But, I still think, they'd probably find a way to get it done if they really wanted it to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the Trump administration is increasingly trying to criminalize observing ICE from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I personally don't care for that, but as I said in the regards to the previous post, the state can justify enforcing whatever laws it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. They have the legal monopoly of force. They control the courts and the legal system. You don't control any of that. You can say, those people will say, what about voting? And voting, as I said, if voting really mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. And that just goes to show you, the state's inherently going to be the ones in a position of power pretty much 100% of the time. And that's why increasingly, I don't really care for any of the laws it makes. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, if you want to observe ICE, I think you should be able to. And if you want to be on top of them constantly, I think you should be able to, just by doing whatever you want to. With that being said, if you think they're literally as dangerous as the Gestapo, as I've said many times in the past, you probably don't want to be around them and constantly pestering them, not just to trying to bait them to attack you. But, that's very much how the Reddit mind works. Reddit just constantly wants to bait and anger people for attention. And that, that's pretty much social media at this point, I would say. All social media, not just Reddit, but yeah, that's my thoughts there. Next, we have every single one of the 25 GOP members of the U.S. House Oversight Committee, including John McGuire, or Virginia, boycotted yesterday's deposition of Les Wexner, the patron and financer of Jeffrey Epstein, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crosspost from the Virginia subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but if they want to boycott for whatever reason, ultimately they can justify doing that. I think the libertarian position is, we gotta hold these Epstein clients accountable, but people only want to hold them accountable when they're in the out group rather than the in group. It's a lot like how Reddit wants to hold Donald Trump accountable for his role in the Epstein files, but they don't care to hold Bill Clinton accountable for doing pretty much the same stuff. Because, Bill Clinton's in group. They'll occasionally go after Clinton. You can see a rare picture of him on Epstein Island, trend on Reddit occasionally. But, that they definitely care more that Trump's in the Epstein files. They don't really care that anyone else is in there besides Donald Trump. And that's very much how Reddit works. They're a lot like the Trump worship cult, and only instead of worshiping Trump, they think he's literally Hitler or the Antichrist. But regardless, in both cases, Trump worship syndrome and Trump derangement syndrome, all politics revolves around the orange man, and that's personally not something I care for. I think we need to hold all the Epstein class accountable, but sadly, I don't think that's going to happen. Eventually people will move on to whatever the next thing is, next headlines are, and, that's how very much politics works, is whatever the current thing is. And the Epstein files, they've stayed in the headlines more than I thought they would at this point. I thought they would have probably petered out by now, but, ultimately, eventually people do always move on to whatever the next thing is. Next, we have his lawsuit against the IRS, his lawsuit against the BBC, and now this. I'm convinced he only knows one number, posted by HarryCut9721, and that's a crosspost from the Next Gen Business subreddit. Trump's $10 billion shift to his Board of Peace slammed as illegal, and that was a tweet from a Representative Mel Stansbury tweeted, "This is not illegal." And now, as he's quoting Aaron Blake, Trump announces he's transferring $10 billion from the U.S. government to his Board of Peace, which critics have likened to a giant slush fund Trump will control. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, that's the government for you. They can justify throwing money at whatever they want to. And when it's the out group in power, Reddit cares a lot. But when it's the in group in power, Reddit doesn't care. When the in group's in power, they're usually throwing money at their progressive NGO friends. But Reddit only cares about it when the out group does it. That's personally, I don't really care for politics because it's just a giant grift. Trump's definitely part of that grift, and he's probably one of the most open about it, I would say. But they're all grifters, despite Reddit. Well, not all of them, I'd say. There's rare exceptions like Thomas Massey, but they're pretty much all grifters who just seek to enrich themselves, and that's pretty much why I don't trust government, because it's naturally going to be, people are naturally self-interested, and if people are in a position to enrich themselves through the state, they probably will, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Americans paid to destroy Gaza. Now we are paying to rebuild Gaza. Agree or disagree? From YouTube.com, posted by Apollo Delphi, and that's cross-post from the Live News 24H subreddit. Justin, Trump says U.S. government is contributing $10 billion to the Board of Peace, and that's the YouTube video from Bloomberg News. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if people want to pay to destroy Gaza or rebuild Gaza, they should be able to, spend money on whatever you want to. But with that being said, I don't think U.S. taxpayer money should be going to Gaza, just like it shouldn't be going to Ukraine or Israel or any other country for that matter, because, ultimately, well, I guess if people want to earmark their money to go to a foreign country, you could argue that for voluntary taxation that would be okay, but right now for the current system of forced taxation where you don't get to determine where your money is going to, I think the libertarian position is you shouldn't be just sending that money overseas because people probably want it spent here rather than overseas. But ultimately the government can justify throwing money wherever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next we have, in an extraordinary and illegal move, Trump says he's transferring $10 billion from the U.S. government to his Board of Peace, which he chairs and can therefore use his funds as he wishes. Posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's crosspost from the underreported news subreddit. And yeah, personally, as I said, if Trump wants to throw $10 billion to his Board of Peace, he's in a position to throw money wherever he wants to. A lot of people are going to defer to whatever the president says in matters of law. And personally, I don't really care for that, but that's just how law works. The people in positions of power can justify doing wherever they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have no expense has been spared. Inside, luxury jet DHS wants to buy for deportations from NBCNews.com, posted by Fear the Creeper, and they added an executive jet at the Department of Homeland Security has told the White House's Office of Management budget it would need for deportation flights and cabinet officials. Travel features a bedroom and a queen bed, showers, a kitchen, 4 large flat-screen TVs, and even a bar, according to images of the aircraft obtained by NBC News. And yeah, personally, I don't think the DHS needs that luxury jet. But as I said, ultimately the government can justify throwing money at whatever it wants to throw it at, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have last week Donald Trump registered the trademark Donald J. Trump International Airport. This week, Florida Republicans voted to rename Palm Beach International Airport Donald J. Trump International Airport, putting taxpayers in luck for licensing fees that go straight to him. Posted from WESH.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's crosspost from the underreported news subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. But if you want to, as I said, ultimately the government it can throw money at whatever it wants to, and if they want to rename an airport after Donald Trump, they can justify doing that too, especially if the airport is state controlled. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Supreme Court strikes down bulk of Trump's tariffs from thehill.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for tariffs. They're just taxed and imported goods. But ultimately, ultimately the government might still find a way to get around the Supreme Court, and that's something that's important to consider too. Ultimately the government's going to justify whatever it wants to justify. Just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't mean that it's actually going to be able to enforce it. And ultimately, Trump, if he wants to find a way to justify getting around the Supreme Court, maybe he will. Ultimately, a lot of people do defer to the executive branch over the judicial branch when it comes to the government. But yeah, that's that. Ultimately, people are gonna. It doesn't really matter what happens because ultimately, they're just gonna keep enriching themselves regardless. Next we have, I just got permanently banned from r/libertarian, posted by samwill226, and they said, I stated that libertarians believe minimal government with an anarchist who fully believe no government. I got banned for spreading lies. WTF is happening, lol. And yeah, normally they remove these, well, it looks like they already got removed because you can't talk about other subreddits, but I guess I'll go over that since I already talked about it. And ultimately, Reddit's very much into censorship at this point. If you dare dissent against whatever, if a mod just doesn't like the way you think or say anything, they'll just censor you. And that's why increasingly Reddit isn't a platform for discussion. It's a controlled platform where those in positions of power can justify controlling the conversation however they want to. And that's why it's a lot like government in that regard. Government, those in positions of power can justify whatever they want to. Same with Reddit, those in positions of power can justify whatever they want to. And that's why I personally am against pretty much all hierarchical structures of power. If people want to form voluntary collective structures of power, I think that's fine. But right, if you're forced to participate in it, I guess you're not forced to participate in Reddit, but still, it's not good when someone who's in a position of power can just censor anything they want to because they don't like it, or they consider it to be wrong think. And that's my thoughts there. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.